Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm marketing operations here at Smarty. Today's webinar is about open source and crowdsourced data, and we're very excited to get started. But before we do, let's go over a couple of the standard housekeeping items. One, yes, this webinar will be recorded, and we will send a copy of it out to everyone who registered. So if you have to step out early, you can do so, and you'll be able to see that in your inbox later today. To interact with our presenter and other audience members, feel free to use the chat feature in the Zoom webinar interface or the Q&A feature, also in the Zoom webinar interface. We'll bring up as many of those questions to our presenter as we can. So speaking of our presenter, today we have Adam Charlton, one of our software engineers and head developer of one of our products, the master address list. If you're not familiar with that, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But without further ado, Adam Charlton.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Andrew. Yeah, so like you mentioned, today we're going to be talking about some of the huge benefits and some of the pitfalls of open source and crowdsourced data. Now, these two are really a similar term, and so we're going to go through and define them a little bit. We're going to lean a little bit more on the crowdsourced data. Throughout this, the purpose of this is really to give you guys a sense of how can I get started with crowdsourced data. What are some of the things that I can look out for, but also what are some of the benefits that I can and some of the value that I can get out of some of this data. So going into it, if I can change the screen here, the biggest thing that we really need to do at the outset of this is really defining what crowdsourced data is. And I struggled with this for a long time because this is a really broad topic that we really needed to narrow down for the sake of this webinar so that we could actually have some concrete things to talk about. For the purpose of this webinar, we're going to define crowdsourced data as data that is gathered and curated by individuals. Now, the curation of data by individuals is really going to be the critical part that we're going to be focusing on here, because there are a lot of legitimate business models that are using data that's gathered by individuals, but they have an internal verification system, or they are curating the data themselves in some way so that they have full ownership of it. And that differs from crowdsourced data, which is what we're going to be focusing on, where the data is curated by the same individuals in the community that are gathering and supplying the data. Now, this has a very lacking of a central overriding authority or verification system. If you think Wikipedia and how it operates, that is essentially the model that we are going to be talking about. Now, us as Smarty, we are an address company here. And so I feel the most qualified to talk about OpenStreetMaps as sort of our gold standard for crowdsourced data in this industry. With OpenStreetMaps, it very much like Wikipedia is a crowdsourced sense of information. Many people submit different addresses, building footprints, road information, all sorts of things to OpenStreetMaps. And it is then curated by that same community of individuals. So they are going to be the focal point of our analysis when we're talking about a lot of the pros and cons of crowdsourced data and how it can benefit what you're working on. So with that, we're going to get right ahead and talk about the good. What good can we extract from this open source crowdsourced data? One of the best things is the local regionalization that we can get. Data is different all around the country and more than country all around the world. Even if we just focus on the US for address information, if you look at addresses in New York and New Orleans and even Hawaii or the West Coast like Los Angeles, each of these different places have their own culture and traditions and customs, and the addresses in those areas reflect those. And so addresses are different. They're formatted different. People talk about them in different ways. And when you have community-led data gathering, this local regionalization really reflects that. Addresses in your data set are going to be reflective of where they came from how people actually are using the data. To bring an example a little bit closer to home here at Smarty, Utah addresses are often a little bit different. They don't have a street suffix like street or road or way in the same way that addresses in a lot of other places around the US do. And that's something that a lot of other address providers um, can't ever seem to get quite right. They always throw in a street on there because it has to have it, even though here in Utah and the people that actually live here, we all know that's bogus. Addresses often don't have street affixed to the street name. That just doesn't happen. With OpenStreetMaps, you don't have that problem because the data is supplied by the people who actually live here, who know the way that addresses are supposed to be. And that's really cool. But addresses aren't solely limited to the US. And this is another benefit of this crowdsourcing of data, is that addresses are supplied from wherever people are living. And so you get data all around the world, not just in the US, but from London and Canada and Australia and many other places. Wherever people live, they can feel free to contribute to this ever-growing source of information, and it really builds up this worldwide community. But in my opinion, by far the most beneficial aspect of crowdsourcing communities is the community behind it itself. Due to the very nature of how data is gathered and curated and structured, you have this very passionate group of individuals who are motivated to see things done with the data that they're supplying. And so if you have any questions or you want to do something interesting, you can hop on the forums, ask questions. And there's a very passionate group of individuals who will go and answer your questions and make sure that you're getting all the resources that you need in order to do what you want to do. Some of the other good options that aren't quite as prominent, but it still is necessary to talk about, is obviously the cost. This type of data is often very low or no cost information to get, so you can get up and running with it right away. It also allows for rapid updates, often before any official forms of data come out to supply it. Like if a new building construction pops up, a very dedicated member in that community could add it and add the address to OpenStreetMaps, for example, before the government officially registers it, it pays taxes on it, it goes through, it gets an official mailbox or any of those other types of official sources of verification have registered the address. OpenStreetMaps might already have that data. Now, before we jump into some of the hardships of OpenStreetMaps or other crowdsources of information, I want to talk about one problem that it really doesn't have. So there's a lot of talk about, and perhaps you've seen it as well, like on Wikipedia, which is vandalism and sabotage. This is one of the things that when people talk about crowdsourcing information is the thing that they're really worried about. And in my experience, especially with smaller repositories such as OpenStreetMap, this really hasn't been all that much of an issue. It's not something to be completely ignored, of course, but it's not as big of an issue as people make it out to be. In many ways, Wikipedia has almost become a victim of its own success, where it's become so popular and so ingrained in a cultural sense that if people want to promote an idea, they maybe will go and inject their own ideas into Wikipedia or intentionally sabotage it because they know it's a high traffic area. For some smaller data repositories like OpenStreetMaps, it really doesn't suffer from a lot of the same problems that another source like Wikipedia would. It's a very useful source of information, has very high quality of data, but it doesn't quite hit that level where people feel the need to go and vandalize data in order to try and intentionally shut other people down. It's not something to be completely ignored, of course. And the data quality, whenever you ingest it, is something that's very critical that you keep in mind. But I've also not found it to be as much of a problem as perhaps people make it out to be. But moving on to some real problems that I think come with its own very distinct set of drawbacks is first and foremost the quality. Before we talked about localization, when you allow all sorts of different styles of localization from people who are actually using the addresses in their local communities or other types of data, you can't enforce any sort of standardization. When you enforce standardization, that removes the power that people in their local communities have to put in the data how they have it. But when you can't enforce standards, then you have a bunch of data that don't have standards. So in regards to address information, there's a lot of directional information, north, south, east, west. Are those supposed to be capitalized, or is the entire word supposed to be capitalized, only the first letter? Are they supposed to be abbreviated? Is north just supposed to go to N, or is it supposed to be fully spelled out north? As well as, street names like McDonald often traditionally has capital M, capital D, but that's not always enforced. And so in many cases along a single street, if you have several different people who are supplying data, you could have 2 or 3 or more different standards, even for the exact same street name as you're going down. In preparation for this, I played a lot with OpenStreetMaps, and I went and visited a whole bunch of the places, looked at all the data quality at places where I've previously lived, and I saw standards all over the place. There wasn't any good unifying standard because people have the flexibility to put in the addresses how they use them. And even in the same community, you can get wildly different levels of quality. And speaking of quality, again, we talked about in regards to vandalism. I don't believe vandalism is a huge concern in these types of data sets. And so not due to malicious input, but just simply genuine mistakes can really reduce the quality of an overall system. I pulled up a map from OpenStreetMaps here. This is close to an area where I used to live. These are one-way roads, and someone did genuinely come in and mark them as one-way roads in and out of this apartment complex. There was a mistake made, though, where both of the one-way roads are pointing in the same direction. This isn't a genuine mistake. Someone was trying, or this wasn't malicious. This was a genuine mistake. Someone really was trying to put in the best data that they had possible. And the individual, though, maybe being confused with the tool because it is a heavy tool, didn't quite know how to specify the direction of the one-way road. And so misput it in where the 2 one-way roads are pointing in the same direction. This isn't malicious, but if you were going to ingest this data, it could potentially cause a lot of problems when you have stuff like this, when you're relying on this data to be good. And if you're trying to write a mapping software to try and organize your delivery people, this would really trip you up, because according to this map, there is no road that is going into this apartment complex, and that's a big deal. And quality concerns like that happen all over the data, not just with one-way streets, but with building footprints, like we mentioned before, with address standardization. Maybe the address isn't in the form that you were expecting it, and all other sorts of genuine mistakes can lead to an overall drop in quality of your product. One of the other things that we need to talk about is the incomplete source of data. This data is, due to its very nature, provided by the people who live in these communities. This is, once again, also close to an area where I used to live. And you can see here, the quality on these buildings is actually really high. I double checked a lot of it, and I even supplied some of my own data in this area. But all of these buildings, you can see that they have an immense amount of detail on their building footprints. But there is a whole neighborhood here that isn't shown. Every single one of these streets has dozens of houses on it, where you might have a couple dozen or maybe even a low hundred number of houses in this area, and you can't see any of them. You can see this grouping of houses, and you can see some public buildings like this elementary school over here, and that's about it. This makes it difficult to rely on this type of data. I can imagine that someone lives in this neighborhood right here in this grouping of houses and is an address nerd just like I am, and they decided to put in all of their neighbors' houses. It's a lot of work putting in this data. And so when they got past their neighborhood, they stopped. And it's this way all over the country. There's areas of very good, high quality, high density data, and then large periods where there's just simply nothing. And that's really hard to balance, especially with that such a wild, varying amount of coverage. Where if you're trying to make some types of applications, for example, like if you had to worry about, an optimal bus route is the example that I put here. Some other things are delivery routes, or, if you're uh, trying to find a good neighborhood to deliver Girl Scout cookies, even, right? Trying to look at this map, it's going to make your task nigh impossible with this data set, simply because the data is nowhere near as complete as you might think it will be. The information that's there is good, but often it's simply not there because someone hasn't taken the time to go and provide it. And with all of this, we really have to worry about the balancing act. You really can't, with crowdsourced data, you really can't separate the good and the bad. They are intricately tied together in a way that makes it difficult to balance. When you have good localization, like we talked about, people are adding in their data from how they use it. With addresses, they're adding in the data with their standardization to their local area. If you can't enforce that, then you have little to no standardization where different people, even in the same neighborhood, are putting in the data as they see it, which leads to very inconsistent data. You can have people that immediately are updating their data the second that it goes live. The problem with that means that you have very little verification. You can't verify that this new address that they added is truly there or not, or is old or stale data, because some of the government, the official sources, the official verification services haven't caught up with it. And so it makes it impossible to know whether this is a real address that OpenStreetMaps has added ahead of time, ahead of everyone else, or is simply a mistake and someone mistakenly added it and it will be removed later. You can have potentially high quality of data from the stuff that you get out of OpenStreetMaps, but you have incredibly inconsistent coverage of that data where it's hard to rely on the completeness of any of that data. This is the sort of product where if you wanted to get every address in the city or every address in the state even, it's a nigh impossible task. You can't do it. The coverage simply is not good enough. And whether or not this is an acceptable trade-off is something that when you're evaluating your own product, you're going to have to determine if these trade-offs are acceptable, because there's really no separating them. One thing that I hear that I've seen a lot of is using some sort of external verification service. And this can have, and in fact, and this has some pros and cons to it as well. Where if you're using a service to say, come in, let's talk about standardization in particular, because for example, Smarty has a very good standardization service in our engine that we have. If you use Smarty to come in and say, standardize all of the addresses within OpenStreetMaps, that is something that you can do and can be done with pretty good efficiency. But at that point, why are you using OpenStreetMaps if you're already using an external verification service? You should just go fully in on that service instead of trying to worry about cleaning up OpenStreetMaps and crowdsource information.
So, Adam, a question here though on that: um, if my address cleaning provider doesn't also provide raw data, so if I'm able to get from an open source every address from a city, and then I can just go through and clean it up with another tool, not all tools will actually provide you just all of the addresses in a city. Is that right? So doesn't it make sense that they need to go hand in hand?
You can use that, but it also removes it can give you a false sense of security, let's say.
Okay.
And that goes back to the coverage problem. I think that that is a genuine strategy that you can use. And if you are set on using open source data, I highly recommend that you use an external verification source because it does provide you a lot of the value. of, for example, standardization. But you have to be worried that it doesn't provide you, due to some of the coverage problems of open source data, that you don't get lulled into a false sense of security by going, hey, if I'm using this verification source, I now know every single thing that's in this city, because you're still going to run into a lot of gaps.
Sure.
A verification source can't invent data where there is none. Now, some data providers, such as Smarty, we offer a master address list, which is a saturation file that gives you coverage. But if you're solely using verification source with OpenStreetMaps, you need to be cautious about those types of things. Great.
Good.
And with that, we're going to be wrapping up here. Andrew, I think I'm going to be turning it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. So I guess coming back to that same question we were having before. So
Of course.
much like you're saying with Wikipedia and other open or crowdsourced locations, when it comes to the trust that you have in that data, is your trust more is the trustworthy lower in quantity or in quality, or is it both?
It has to be in both. When you talk from and perhaps I want to try and not go overly technical here, but maybe I'll be able to show off my my address nerdiness a little bit here, right?
Sure.
We
That's
talk
what we
about
came
two
here for.
different, we talk about two different types of errors. We talk about false positives and false negatives is a little bit more technical term for what you're talking about. False positive is we say there's an address there, but the address doesn't really exist. And a false
Sure.
negative is we say there's no address, but one really does exist. Open source data hits pretty hard on both ends. They have a lot of data that is hard to verify. And so you run the risk of a lot of false positives. But with coverage, you also run the risk of a lot of false negatives. With a more standard provider, such as Smarty, we try to mitigate both sides, but we definitely lean harder on trying to mitigate false positives. So if we say an address is there, we are really, really positive it's there. With crowdsourced data, they tend to lean a little bit on the other side. They really try to say, these addresses are good, they're really interesting, please have them. So they lean a little bit harder into having more false positives.
Okay. So I'm just trying to think of this in a practical standpoint. Let's say I want to send a mailer to every address in the city of Provo, Utah, which is where Smarty is based. And I don't want to buy a list for some reason. So I go and I find some crowdsourced list or some open source list that contains all of these addresses. And I go, great, I want to mail these, but I want to save money by not sending to bad email addresses. So I take that list and I run it through Smarty's address validation tool. If the crowdsourced list didn't contain some addresses, there's nothing Smarty can do to make sure that you're able to send to those. And those crowdsourced lists are going to say this does exist in a case where Smarty's address validation tool is going to give you, we're going to make sure we're not giving you a false positive. Is that right? So really,
yeah, that would be a really good way to say combining an external verification product where you have OpenStreetMap and it gives you a whole bunch of addresses, not all of them, but it gives you a whole bunch of them, and a bunch of them might be wrong. And then you apply a product such as Smarty on top of it, and it cuts out all of the bad addresses so that you know that everything that you have is pretty good.
Sure.
Yes, that is a fantastic way to combine a couple of different using crowdsourced data with a verification service in order to provide very high quality results.
Excellent. A question came in just now that is what I was going to talk about in a second. Anyway, you said that Smarty will provide data using the master address list. How much more coverage typically does the master address list provide than using if you were going to use a crowdsourced data source?
Again, this type of question is very hard simply because it's difficult to try and coverage varies wildly between areas. So like in really high density city type areas, coverage is pretty good. For rural and suburban communities, coverage is pretty bad. I I would say that in terms of total coverage, how much more would, for example, Smarty's master address list cover? It might even be up to 10x in rural and suburban areas.
Especially when it comes to that the trustworthiness
Yes.
level that we were just discussing. So also, and if you guys are curious about this, you can visit smarty.com, and under our products tab is the master address list. But what master address list is I could do exactly what I was saying. I want to send an email or a mailer to everyone in the city of Provo. I can purchase a master address list for the city of Provo and get every address that has been standardized and validated, and it's much more effective than going off of a crowdsourced list. Coming back to what Adam was saying, I mean, if you're willing to do the balancing act, you don't have to go this route, but that is a solution. And if you do go the balancing act route, we highly suggest validating your tool. And of course, Smarty's validation tools are going to be the ones you want to use. But hopefully that answers your question. So thank you. That's all we've got for you guys today. We hope you guys had a great time. Thank you, Adam, for your time. Thank you for your data. Lessons in crowdsourcing and open source data. We hope you guys all had a good time, that you can come to future webinars as they come up. Thanks again.